It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend of fishing, but when the ranger hit play, everything changed. The morning mist clung to the Cascade River like a shroud, and Ranger Jim Martinez knew these waters well enough to spot something that didn't belong. 23 years patrolling the Oregon wilderness had taught him to trust his instincts, and today they were screaming. The silver device bobbed against a fallen log, half submerged in the debris that had collected after the recent storms. At first glance, it looked like just another piece of camping gear lost to the current, but the red recording light blinking weakly through the water told a different story. Jim waded into the cold water, his boots finding purchase on the slick riverbed. The camera was a high-end trail cam, the kind serious hunters and researchers used to monitor wildlife. But this wasn't mounted on a tree or positioned to capture passing deer. This was floating free, its waterproof casing scarred and dented, the memory card somehow still intact after what must have been days in the water. Back at the ranger station, Jim connected the camera to his laptop, with hands that had begun to shake without him quite knowing why. The first few files were corrupted, but the last recording remained intact. A timestamp showed it was created 5 days ago, September 23, 2024, the same day that David Thornton and his 15-year-old daughter Emma had disappeared. When Jim pressed play, the first thing he saw was Emma's face, bright with anticipation, as she adjusted the camera on what appeared to be a makeshift tripod of river rocks. Her long brown hair caught the morning light, and her smile was genuine, the kind of expression that made what came next all the more devastating. Day 1 of the great father-daughter fishing expedition, she announced to the camera, her voice carrying that particular blend of excitement and teenage sarcasm that only comes from spending time with a parent you're trying to impress. Dad says we're going to catch enough trout to feed half of Pine Grove, but I'm betting we'll be eating granola bars for dinner. The camera captured a wide shot of their campsite along the Cascade River, about 12 miles upstream from where Jim had found the device. David Thornton moved into frame, a man in his early 40s with the kind of weathered hands that spoke of decades working outdoors. His smile seemed forced, tight around the edges, and even through the grainy footage, Jim could see the dark circles under his eyes. "Don't listen to her," David said, ruffling Emma's hair as she playfully swatted him away. "I've been fishing these waters since before she was born. We'll have trout for breakfast, lunch, and dinner if we want." But there was something in his voice, Jim noticed. Something that didn't match the casual banter. A tremor, almost imperceptible, that suggested David Thornton was carrying more than just fishing gear into those woods. The story of David and Emma Thornton's disappearance had already consumed the small town of Pine Grove for 5 days. David was a respected contractor who'd built half the houses in the valley, a man known for his reliability and his devotion to his daughter. Emma was a sophomore at Pine Grove High, an honor student who played violin in the school orchestra and had dreams of studying marine biology. They were the kind of father and daughter that other families envied. Close, supportive, seemingly untroubled by the usual tensions that marked teenage years. But every family has its secrets, and the Thorntons were no exception. Margaret Thornton had died in a car accident 3 years earlier, leaving David to raise Emma alone. The accident had been ruled a tragic result of icy roads and poor visibility, but those who knew the family understood it was more complicated than that. Margaret had been driving home from what she'd told David was a book club meeting, but the book club had been canceled that week. She'd been coming from somewhere else entirely, and the questions that discovery raised had never been fully answered. David had thrown himself into his work after the funeral, taking on project after project, as if staying busy could somehow fill the void Margaret had left behind. Emma had watched her father withdraw, had seen how he'd started drinking alone on the porch after she'd gone to bed, had noticed the way he'd sometimes stare at her mother's empty chair, as if willing her back to life. The fishing trip had been Emma's idea, a way to reconnect with her father who seemed to be slipping further away with each passing month. She'd suggested it over dinner the week before, watching as something flickered in his eyes. Hope, maybe, or perhaps just the desperate desire to feel normal again. "Remember when we used to go camping with Mom?" she'd said, twirling spaghetti around her fork. "You always said the three of us should do the whole river next time." David had looked up from his plate, and for a moment, Emma had seen her father as he used to be. Before the accident, before the drinking, before the weight of single parenthood had settled on his shoulders like a physical burden. "The whole river," he'd repeated quietly. "Your mom always said she wanted to see where it started." They'd planned the trip for the following weekend, a 3-day expedition that would take them along the most remote stretch of the Cascade River. David had seemed genuinely excited as they'd packed gear and planned their route, but Emma had noticed things that troubled her. The way he'd insisted on bringing extra alcohol, far more than they'd need for 3 days. The way he'd become agitated when she'd suggested telling someone else about their plans. "We don't need to check in with anyone," he'd said, his voice sharper than usual. "It's just the two of us, Em. Like it's supposed to be." The last person to see them alive was Gary Chen, who ran the bait shop at the edge of town. He'd watched them load their gear into David's blue pickup truck on the morning of September 23rd, noting that David had seemed nervous, constantly checking his phone and looking over his shoulder as if expecting someone to appear. "Emma seemed excited," Gary would later tell investigators. "She was talking about the camera she was bringing, how she wanted to document the whole trip. But her dad? He looked like a man running from something. I should have said something. I should have asked if everything was okay." But Gary had minded his own business, as people in small towns often do, and by the time anyone realized something was wrong, David and Emma Thornton had already been missing for 48 hours. The alarm had been raised by Emma's English teacher, Mrs. Patterson, who'd noticed the girl's absence from school on Monday morning. Emma had never missed a day without calling in, and when Mrs. Patterson tried to reach David, all her calls went straight to voicemail. A check of the house revealed an empty mailbox and newspapers piling up on the front porch, suggesting no one had been home for days. By Tuesday morning, Sheriff's Deputy Rachel Santos was organizing search parties, coordinating with state police and park rangers to comb the vast wilderness area where the Thorntons had planned to fish. The search area covered nearly 200 square miles of dense forest, rushing water and terrain that could easily hide a body, or two. The first 3 days of searching yielded nothing. No trace of David's truck, no sign of their campsite, no evidence they'd ever made it to the river at all. Some began to wonder if they'd left town entirely, if David had finally decided to start over somewhere else. But Emma's belongings were still in her bedroom, her college application essays still saved on her laptop, her entire life waiting for her return. On the 4th day, a search team found David's truck parked at a trailhead about 15 miles from Pine Grove. The vehicle was unlocked, keys still in the ignition, but there was no sign of the camping gear or fishing equipment they'd loaded so carefully. More disturbing was what they found in the truck's bed. A small pool of dried blood, not enough to indicate a serious injury, but enough to suggest something had gone wrong. The truck's discovery expanded the search area considerably, focusing efforts on the network of trails and waterways that branched out from the trailhead. But the terrain was treacherous, and early fall weather had brought intermittent rain that washed away tracks and made navigation difficult. Search dogs picked up scents that led nowhere, and helicopter overflights revealed only endless forest canopy. It was on the 5th day that Ranger Martinez found the camera, floating downstream from where anyone had thought to look. The device represented the first real evidence of what had happened to David and Emma Thornton, but what it revealed was far more disturbing than anyone had imagined. The footage began innocuously enough. Emma had set up the camera to record their first morning by the river, capturing the routine of setting up camp and preparing for a day of fishing. But as Jim watched the video, he began to notice details that made his skin crawl. The way David's hands shook as he rigged his fishing line. The way he kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting to see something in the trees. The way Emma's cheerful narration couldn't quite mask the underlying tension that seemed to permeate their campsite. "Dad's been fishing this spot since he was a kid," Emma told the camera, but her voice had a forced quality that suggested she was trying to convince herself as much as the viewer. "He says the big ones hide in the deep pools where the current slows down." David moved through the frame like a man sleepwalking, his movements mechanical and distant. When Emma tried to engage him in conversation, his responses were brief and distracted. The easy camaraderie Jim had expected to see between father and daughter was nowhere in evidence. The camera had been programmed to record in intervals throughout the day, capturing snippets of their activities like a time-lapse of a family vacation gone wrong. In one segment, David could be seen drinking directly from a bottle while Emma fished alone downstream, her small figure dwarfed by the towering pines. In another, Emma was trying to start a campfire while David sat motionless on a log, staring into the water with an expression that could only be described as haunted. But it was the footage from the second day that truly chilled Jim to the bone. The camera's motion sensor had been triggered by something moving through the trees across the river, a figure that remained frustratingly out of focus, visible only as a dark shape flitting between the shadows. Emma had noticed it too, her voice dropping to a whisper as she pointed toward the forest. "Dad, there's someone over there," she said. But David didn't look up from his fishing line. His lack of response seemed to frustrate her, and she moved closer to the camera, her face filling the frame. "I keep seeing someone in the trees. It's like they're watching us." When David finally did look up, his expression was strange, not concerned or protective, as one might expect, but almost resigned. "It's probably just a hiker," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "People camp out here all the time." The figure in the trees had disappeared by then, but Emma continued to glance nervously toward the forest throughout the rest of the day. The camera captured her growing unease, the way she stayed closer to camp, the way she jumped at every sound from the woods. That night, the camera's infrared mode recorded something that made Jim's blood run cold. Around 2 a.m., a clear figure could be seen moving through their campsite while David and Emma slept in their tent. The person moved with purpose, examining their gear, looking through their packs, even peering into the tent where father and daughter lay unconscious. The figure's face was never visible, but their movements suggested familiarity with the area and complete comfort in the darkness. Most disturbing of all was David's reaction when the figure approached his sleeping bag. Rather than waking with alarm, he seemed to stir only slightly, as if he'd been expecting the intrusion. The camera captured what appeared to be a brief, whispered conversation between David and the mysterious visitor, though the audio was too poor to make out actual words. The next morning, Emma seemed unaware that anything had happened, but David was visibly agitated. He paced the campsite, constantly checking his phone despite the lack of cell service, and made several attempts to convince Emma they should head home early. "I think we've had enough adventure for one trip," he said, but Emma was determined to stay for their planned third day. "We barely caught anything yesterday," she protested, "and you promised we'd try the deep pools upstream." David's reluctance was palpable, but he seemed unable to deny his daughter's request. They packed up their campsite that morning, but instead of heading home, they moved deeper into the wilderness, following the river toward the remote pools Emma had mentioned. The final footage was the most disturbing of all. The camera's timestamp showed it was recorded on September 25th, the day before the device was found floating downstream. Emma had positioned the camera to capture their new campsite, but the angle inadvertently recorded something else entirely. In the background, barely visible through the trees, another figure could be seen watching them. But this wasn't the same person who had visited their camp in the night. This figure was different, smaller, more furtive, moving with the jerky, panicked movements of someone who was afraid to be seen. Emma's voice on the recording was strained, though she was clearly trying to maintain her cheerful documentation of their trip. "Day 3, and we're really in the middle of nowhere now. Dad says the fishing is going to be incredible, but I'm starting to think we should have stayed closer to the truck." David was off camera, but his voice could be heard in the background, and there was something in his tone that made Jim's skin crawl. "Don't worry about the truck, Em. We won't be needing it for a while." The conversation that followed was partially obscured by the sound of rushing water, but fragments came through clearly enough to paint a disturbing picture. Emma questioning why they'd brought so much gear for a 3-day trip. David's evasive answers about their plans to return home. Emma's growing realization that her father might not be telling her the truth about something fundamental. The final minutes of the recording were chaos. The camera had been knocked over during what appeared to be a struggle, and the angle captured only a confusing jumble of legs and shadows. Emma's voice could be heard, no longer cheerful but frightened and urgent. "Dad, what are you doing? Let go of me!" David's response was inaudible, but the tone was desperate, pleading. There was the sound of splashing, as if someone had fallen or been pushed into the water. Then Emma's voice again, closer to the camera now, gasping and panicked. "Someone help us, please! If anyone finds this—" The recording cut off abruptly, leaving only the sound of rushing water and the terrible silence of the wilderness. Jim sat back in his chair, his hands shaking as he replayed the final seconds of footage. The implications were staggering. Not only had David and Emma Thornton met with some kind of violence by the river, but the camera had captured evidence of what appeared to be a complex sequence of events involving multiple people. The forensics team that examined the camera found additional evidence that deepened the mystery. Digital analysis revealed that several files had been deliberately deleted from the device, suggesting someone had tried to edit the footage after the fact. More disturbing still, enhancement of the audio tracks revealed what appeared to be a third voice in the background during the final recording, someone speaking in hushed tones just outside the camera's range. Detective Sarah Mills, who'd been called in from the state police to lead the investigation, spent hours analyzing every frame of the footage. The figure who had visited their camp in the night remained frustratingly unidentifiable, but digital enhancement revealed enough detail to confirm it was definitely a human presence, not an animal or trick of light. Someone was stalking them, Detective Mills concluded during a briefing with the search team. The question is whether David knew about it, and whether he was complicit in whatever happened to Emma. The investigation took a darker turn when Mills discovered that David Thornton had been in contact with someone in the weeks leading up to the camping trip. Phone records revealed a series of calls to a number registered to Marcus Webb, a man with a criminal history that included assault, theft, and drug possession. Webb had been released from prison 6 months earlier, and his last known address was a cabin in the mountains not far from where the Thorntons had been camping. When police went to question Webb, they found the cabin empty but clearly recently occupied. Food in the refrigerator was still fresh, and there were signs that someone had left in a hurry. Most disturbing of all was what they found in Webb's bedroom. Photographs of Emma Thornton, taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. The photos showed her walking to school, sitting in the park, going about her daily life completely unaware she was being watched. The discovery of the photographs transformed the investigation from a missing persons case into something much more sinister. The timeline suggested that Webb had been stalking Emma for weeks, possibly months, before the camping trip. David's phone records showed that he'd been in regular contact with Webb during this period, though the nature of their conversations remained unclear. Detective Mills pieced together a working theory based on the evidence. Margaret Thornton's death 3 years earlier had left David in serious financial trouble. Her life insurance had been substantial, but most of it had gone to paying off debts and Emma's education fund. David had been struggling to make ends meet, taking on increasingly risky construction projects to stay afloat. Webb, it turned out, had been Margaret's brother, a relationship that David had hidden from Emma and most of the community. Webb had been in prison when Margaret died, but he'd contested the distribution of her assets upon his release. The phone calls between David and Webb had been about money, specifically about Webb's claim that he deserved a share of Margaret's estate. The camping trip, Mills theorized, had been a setup. David, desperate and possibly coerced, had agreed to take Emma to a remote location where Webb could confront her about her mother's inheritance. But something had gone wrong. The footage suggested that Emma had realized the danger she was in, had tried to escape, and had been caught in the middle of a confrontation that had turned violent. The search for Webb intensified, but the man seemed to have vanished into the wilderness he knew so well. His cabin was thoroughly searched, revealing evidence of his obsession with Emma and his deep resentment toward David. Maps of the area were found with the Thorntons' campsite marked, along with notes about river currents and access points. But the most chilling discovery was Webb's journal, which detailed his plans with disturbing clarity. He'd been planning to kidnap Emma for months, motivated by a twisted belief that she was living a life that rightfully belonged to him. The journal revealed that he blamed David for Margaret's death, claiming that David had driven her to the desperation that led to her fatal car accident. "The girl has everything that should have been mine." One entry read, "My sister's house, my sister's money, my sister's life. It's time she learned the truth about her precious father." The journal entries became increasingly unhinged as the camping trip approached, suggesting that Webb's mental state was deteriorating rapidly. The final entry, dated the day before the Thorntons disappeared, was barely legible but contained enough coherent text to be deeply disturbing. "Tomorrow it ends. The girl will know the truth, and David will pay for what he's done. They both will." As the investigation continued, more details emerged about the complex web of relationships and resentments that had led to the tragedy. Margaret's death had indeed been more complicated than anyone had realized. She'd been struggling with depression and financial stress, and her marriage to David had been strained by his inability to provide the stability she needed. The book club meetings she'd been attending were actually counseling sessions, and she'd been considering leaving David when the accident occurred. Webb's obsession with Emma seemed to stem from his belief that she represented the life he'd been denied. He'd grown up in foster care after his parents' death, had never found stability or success, and had spent most of his adult life in and out of prison. Margaret had been his only family, and her death had left him with nowhere to direct his rage except at David and Emma. The breakthrough in the case came when a hiker found Webb's body in a ravine about 20 miles from where the camera had been discovered. He'd been dead for at least a week, apparently from a fall that had broken his neck. Near his body, searchers found Emma's backpack, containing her journal and several personal items that confirmed she'd been with Webb when he died. Emma's journal entries from the camping trip provided the final pieces of the puzzle. She'd realized something was wrong when they'd moved to the second campsite, had noticed that her father was acting strangely, and that someone seemed to be following them. Her final entry, written in a shaking hand, described the confrontation with Webb and her desperate attempt to escape. "Uncle Marcus is here," she'd written. "I didn't even know Mom had a brother. He's saying terrible things about Dad, about money, about how I don't deserve the life I have. Dad is crying and saying he's sorry, but I don't understand what's happening. I'm scared. I think I'm going to run." The journal suggested that Emma had indeed managed to escape during the confrontation, had run into the wilderness with Webb pursuing her. The terrain in that area was treacherous, full of hidden ravines and unstable ground. It appeared that Webb had fallen to his death while chasing Emma, but her fate remained unknown. The search for Emma's body continued for weeks, but the vast wilderness seemed to have swallowed her completely. Some believed she'd perished in the same ravine that had claimed Webb, her body simply deeper or more hidden. Others held out hope that she'd somehow survived, that she was still alive somewhere in the mountains, afraid to return home. David's body was never found, and his role in the tragedy remained a matter of speculation. The evidence suggested he'd been coerced into bringing Emma to the remote location, but whether he'd intended to harm her or had been trying to protect her was unclear. The final footage from the camera showed him in distress, but it was impossible to determine if he was a victim or a perpetrator. The town of Pine Grove struggled to come to terms with the tragedy. The Thorntons had been a respected family, pillars of the community, and the revelation of the dark secrets they'd been carrying shocked everyone who knew them. The construction business David had built collapsed, his employees left without work or explanations. Emma's classmates held vigils and memorials, but the absence of her body made it impossible to achieve any sense of closure. Mrs. Patterson, Emma's English teacher, was particularly affected by the loss. She'd been the one to raise the alarm when Emma failed to return to school, and she blamed herself for not recognizing the signs of trouble earlier. Emma was such a bright girl, she told investigators. She had so much potential, so much life ahead of her. To think that she was carrying this burden, dealing with these family secrets, and none of us knew. The investigation officially closed a year later, with Webb's death ruling out any possibility of prosecution. The case was classified as a murder-suicide, with Webb determined to be responsible for both Emma's disappearance and David's presumed death. But questions remained, loose ends that continued to haunt those who'd been involved in the search. The camera that had captured the final hours of the Thornton family's life was returned to the evidence locker, but the footage remained a source of ongoing analysis. Digital forensics experts continued to examine the files, searching for any clues that might reveal what had happened to Emma or David in their final moments. Detective Mills, who'd led the investigation, never quite let go of the case. She'd seen too many inconsistencies, too many questions that the official conclusion didn't address. The timeline of events didn't quite add up, and the evidence of multiple people at the campsite suggested the tragedy might have been more complex than anyone realized. "There's something we're missing," Mills told her partner during one of their regular reviews of the case. "The camera footage shows at least 3 different people involved in this, but we've only accounted for 2 bodies. Where's the third person? And what were they doing there?" The mystery deepened when, 2 years after the disappearance, a package arrived at the Pine Grove Sheriff's Department with no return address. Inside was a small wooden box containing Emma's class ring and a note written in her handwriting. "I'm sorry I couldn't come home. Tell them I tried to save him." The note was authenticated by handwriting experts, confirming that Emma had indeed survived the initial confrontation with Webb. But the postmark on the package was smudged and unreadable, providing no clues about where it had been sent from or when. The discovery of the note reignited the investigation, but leads were scarce. Emma would be 18 now, legally an adult, and if she was alive, she had every right to remain hidden. The note suggested she'd witnessed something traumatic, possibly David's death, and was too afraid or traumatized to return home. Search teams combed the wilderness once again, this time looking for any sign that Emma might have survived for an extended period in the mountains. They found evidence of temporary shelters, places where someone might have taken refuge from the elements, but nothing that could definitively be linked to Emma or provide clues about her current whereabouts. The psychological toll of the case extended far beyond the immediate family. Pine Grove was a small town where everyone knew everyone else, and the revelation that such darkness could exist beneath the surface of a seemingly normal family shattered the community's sense of security. Parents became overprotective, children were no longer allowed to wander freely, and the wilderness that had once been a source of recreation and beauty became a place of fear and suspicion. Gary Chen, who'd been the last person to see the Thorntons alive, eventually closed his bait shop and moved away. He'd never forgiven himself for not recognizing the signs of trouble, for not asking the questions that might have prevented the tragedy. "I should have known," he told anyone who would listen. "I should have seen that something was wrong." The case took on a life of its own in the local media, spawning documentaries and true crime podcasts that brought unwanted attention to Pine Grove. Tourists began showing up at the trailhead where David's truck had been found, hoping to catch a glimpse of the infamous campsite. The town had to post guards to keep people from disturbing the area, but the attention only seemed to grow. Emma's high school eventually created a scholarship in her name, given annually to a student who showed her combination of academic excellence and creative spirit. The violin she'd played in the school orchestra was donated to the music program, where it continued to be used by students who never knew its tragic history. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of the case was the way it changed people's understanding of the wilderness itself. The Cascade River had always been seen as a place of beauty and recreation, a natural wonder that drew visitors from across the state. After the Thornton tragedy, it became something else entirely, a place where terrible things could happen, where families could vanish without a trace, where the beauty of nature could conceal the darkest human impulses. Ranger Martinez, who'd found the camera, requested a transfer to a different district within months of the investigation's conclusion. He'd spent too many sleepless nights thinking about the footage, about the implications of what he'd witnessed. The wilderness he'd protected for over 2 decades had become a place of nightmares, and he found he could no longer patrol the river without thinking about Emma's terrified voice calling for help. The camera itself became a sort of cursed object in the minds of those who'd worked the case. The footage was studied obsessively by investigators, but it seemed to raise more questions than it answered. The deleted files remained unrecoverable, the identity of the third person remained unknown, and the exact sequence of events that had led to the tragedy remained frustratingly unclear. Detective Mills retired 5 years after the case, but she never stopped thinking about Emma Thornton. She'd kept copies of all the evidence, including the camera footage, and she continued to review it periodically, searching for details that might have been overlooked. In her final report, she wrote, "The Thornton case represents one of the most complex and disturbing investigations of my career. While we've established the basic facts of what occurred, the deeper questions about family secrets, psychological manipulation, and the capacity for ordinary people to commit extraordinary acts of violence remain unanswered." The wilderness where the Thorntons had met their fate continued to attract visitors, but it was forever changed by what had happened there. Hikers reported feeling watched, heard unexplained sounds in the night, and some claimed to see figures moving through the trees that disappeared when approached. Whether these were genuine supernatural phenomena or simply the power of suggestion influenced by knowledge of the tragedy, the effect was the same. The Cascade River had become a place where the line between the natural and the supernatural seemed increasingly thin. Local indigenous elders, whose ancestors had lived in the area for thousands of years, weren't surprised by the reports of strange occurrences. They'd always known that certain places held memories, that violent events could leave impressions on the landscape that lingered long after the participants had died. The spot where the Thorntons had camped, they explained, had become one of those places, a location where the veil between worlds had been torn by tragedy. Emma's bedroom in the family home remained exactly as she'd left it, preserved by the estate administrators who'd taken over David's affairs. Her college applications sat on her desk, half-finished, a reminder of the future that had been stolen from her. Her violin case remained open, the instrument inside still tuned and ready to play, as if she might return at any moment to practice for the orchestra she'd never rejoin. The annual memorial service held in Pine Grove drew smaller crowds each year, but those who attended were deeply affected by the mystery that continued to surround Emma's fate. The note she'd sent suggested she was alive, but the years of silence since then had convinced many that she'd eventually succumbed to the wilderness that had claimed her father and uncle. Mrs. Patterson, who'd organized the first memorial service, never gave up hope that Emma might someday return. She'd received training in trauma counseling after the tragedy, motivated by her desire to help other students who might be struggling with family secrets or personal crises. "Emma taught me that we never really know what's happening in someone else's life," she told her colleagues. "The brightest smile can hide the darkest pain." The case files remained open, officially unsolved despite the presumption of Emma's death. Every few years, someone would claim to have seen her, a young woman matching her description spotted in various locations across the country. These sightings were always investigated, but none ever led to concrete evidence of Emma's survival or whereabouts. The camera footage continued to be analyzed by digital forensics experts, each new technological advancement offering the hope of revealing previously hidden details. But the fundamental mystery remained. What had really happened during those final moments by the river? Who was the third person captured in the background of the footage? And what had driven a family to such a desperate and violent end? The Cascade River continued to flow, indifferent to the human drama that had played out along its banks. The seasons changed, the forest grew and renewed itself, and new families came to camp and fish in the same spots where the Thorntons had met their fate. But for those who knew the story, the river would never be the same. It had become a place of questions without answers, a reminder that even in the most beautiful places, darkness could lurk just beneath the surface. The investigation had revealed that families could harbor secrets that destroyed them, that desperation could drive people to unthinkable acts, and that the wilderness, for all its beauty and majesty, could become a stage for the darkest human impulses. The Thornton case had shown that evil could wear a familiar face, that tragedy could strike without warning, and that sometimes the most innocent victims were those who trusted the wrong people. As the years passed, the case became a cautionary tale told in law enforcement circles, a reminder of the importance of looking beyond surface appearances and asking the hard questions that might prevent similar tragedies. The camera footage was used in training sessions, teaching investigators to look for subtle signs of distress and manipulation that might otherwise go unnoticed. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the Thornton case was the way it changed how people thought about family dynamics and the secrets that could fester within seemingly normal households. The tragedy had shown that wealth and respectability were no protection against the darker impulses that could destroy a family from within. No one knows exactly what happened by that river. The camera captured the final moments of a family's disintegration, but the deeper truths about their relationships, their secrets, and their fears died with them in the wilderness. Emma's note suggested she'd tried to save her father, but from what? And why couldn't she come home? The Cascade River keeps its secrets, flowing endlessly toward the sea, carrying with it the memory of a father and daughter who came seeking peace, but found only tragedy. But someone, or something, was watching. And maybe, just maybe, somewhere in the vast wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, Emma Thornton is still out there, still running from the darkness that destroyed her family, still trying to find her way home.